Okay, folks. So then we're over to the main topic, and again today, and instead of doing a education session with a lot of slides and presentation, we've invited both Felix and Nick to facilitate conversation around interoperability of FBX, OpenUSD, and glTF, kind of starting with the work that they've done around trying to align vertex attributes across these three. So with that said, over to you, Nick and Felix. I'll stop the screen share.
All right, thanks very much. So, uh, hello, Felix, and let me maybe start with some introductory information. Probably folks here are at least marginally familiar with the work that we undertook in the last couple of years over FBX migration, but I just want to start with a little bit of an overview um, of the project. Then I want to show where Felix and I have taken like the first little nugget of work on the project. Then I kind of want to show like an overall overview of the project. And then finally, open up the floor to discussion. So if that works for everybody, um, I'll I'll just get started. So first of all, how long ago was it? 1 year, 2 years, more? Mark Petit, in particular, undertook a really heavy analysis of the feature set of FBX, what's live in FBX, what's deprecated, and sort of just atrophied, and getting on an assay and a survey of all of those features, and then tried to create a matrix lining up those features with USD features and glTF features in order to provide a kind of blueprint or migration uh, outline for how that could proceed. Um, we talked about a lot of stuff at the beginning, like would we make tools for migration? Would we provide guidance for migration? Um, and I feel like we've sort of settled just due to the amount of manpower available. Um, Felix, me, and a couple of others from now and then on guidance is probably the best strategy. And so, with that in mind, we're starting to set up some infrastructure. And I believe Neil or Patrick, you might have already set up a page for us to host results as we progress, if I recall correctly. Um, we haven't really started populating that, but we'll be able to start populating it soon, I think. Um, so the way Mark put it together was he consulted with folks who worked on FBX in particular for throughout the very history of the project from the beginning. He did a lot of interviews, and um, eventually he came up with like a giant spreadsheet, which I'm not gonna share just this minute. Um, but it's really quite in depth. It identifies holes, it identifies things that need more research, and it has like a rather exhaustive list of everything that he found in FBX that he judged to be relevant on a moving forward basis. Um, and so the work that is outstanding when Mark passed that package off to us to continue with is the actual analysis of the gaps in compatibilities and particular strategies. In other words, the spreadsheet has a lot of empty cells that it falls to us to fill in as the body of work that this group can actually get done. And so I think that's the overall view in the project. And I just want to ask Felix, Patrick, Neil, do you have anything to add on this introductory matter?
And that was a very nice history and background. Neil, Felix, anything you want to add?
I think one thing that may be worth adding is that it's not entirely clear yet, like what the outcome of the project should be. So right now it's a lot about like guidance and understanding like where are things already well defined, where are things not so well defined in terms of interoperability. But for example, outcomes could be things need to be more or less strict defined in glTF, or things need to be a little bit differently phrased in USD to make this conversion more seamless in the future. So this might also be a potential outcome for the areas that cannot just be explained with guidance right now, basically. So I think that's already what we're seeing in this current analysis, that there are some areas that will have good or useful ways for conversion in a general sense, or for interoperability in a general sense, but there are other areas where it will be hard, and those might be ones where there actually needs to be like more specification work or more work on declaring how things should be to make this more seamless.
And Patrick and Neil, anything on the infrastructure side?
Just to confirm, yeah, totally. Once we have guidelines or other resources as a result of this, absolutely, we'll get it published publicly on the website. So it's standing by. Yep.
Excellent. So with that, the next two things are to show what Felix and I worked through over like the last week, and then again show the overall outline that I drew up for a proposed way forward, and then discussion. So with that, I am going to gosh, why is I'll be back in 15 seconds.
I think one interesting point would be finding someone on this group or who's willing to contribute with in-depth experience of FBX, because Nick provides a lot from the USD side. I think I can provide a lot from the glTF side. On FBX, we're both in some areas not 100% sure if like things work as we think they do, and we're going to see that in Nick's presentation in a moment, or if things are in practical use, which is the other question. Like, I think that was one of the areas that Mark analyzed very well. FBX is very big in terms of what it covers, but the practical use is smaller than that. So not everything is necessarily of concern for interoperability just because it's not widely used. But yeah, someone who says I can contribute and I know a lot about FBX would be a welcome addition, I think.
Okay, so we're recruiting as part of this call.
All right. Hopefully people miscounted and that was 15 seconds and I'm back.
It worked out just well.
Great. All right. So here's where we are at. We had a rough document that was mailed out some time ago, and it's made the rounds in various forums. We did get community feedback, so anybody on this call who participated in that, thank you very, very much. And so what we did is we wrote an introduction, like just to I'm not asking you to read all this, I'm just telling you. And we wrote an introduction to explain what the problem is. And in particular, thing that comes up frequently is people don't know what to do when you get an ST, for example, in a USD file. What does that correspond to in FBX and glTF? And so we went ahead and we identified all the attributes that came out of the survey, and we came up with the equivalent names. We wrote some notes about how they work. Felix came up with this cool idea of using these drop downs to kind of make little pills to highlight what the types are, which I thought was fun to read. So we worked through that. We added some notes about custom vertex attributes and how they work. We started to talk about blend shapes because it seems like as soon as you have things like vertex positions, you need to be able to talk about how you move from one set of positions to another. We're working on notable differences and gathered a bunch of references. And so this is the state of the thing right now. It's, I think, close to publishable. There's some open stuff. I'm very happy for the collab that got us to this point. So before we open the discussion, do you have anything that you'd like to add about this document, Felix?
No, I think that's a good general overview. I mean, it depends a bit on if we want to go through some of the table here on the call to just talk about like what do these asterisks mean and so on.
Yeah,
Not sure. Yeah.
let's come back to that in just a few minutes. So now I'm going to
Nick,
stop
do you want me
sharing.
to share the link in the chat, or you rather people just kind of focus?
Yeah, if you can share it in the chat, that would be great to set up for when we get back to it in a couple of minutes. All right, so I scraped this information. I scraped this information and organized it out of Mark's original documents into a bunch of chunks. And I asked ChatGPT to give me stupid icons for every page because that tendency that it has, I thought is kind of cute. So the categories that Mark identified were coordinate systems, so axes, handedness, units, axis conversions, node hierarchy stuff. So transformation orders, global and local transforms, quaternions, pre and post rotation handlings and pivots, scene elements, nulls, meshes, instancing, lights and cameras, animation. So there's a number of ways that FBX can shovel animation through the system that we should talk about. Nodes and morphs and bones and constraints. I don't know what audio-driven animation is, but it was right there in Mark's chart, so it's a thing. Physics. This has got rigid colliders, joints, and force sensors and fields, with lots of progress recently in glTF and USD, which is nice. Audio. Here, I've just got written down not supported because as far as I know, audio in glTF is a work in progress and not ratified. But I think it does have this sort of thing. This is obviously something that we can work on, especially because, here I'm talking about the physics extensions, and I think audio is going to be similarly glTF extensions. And finally, there's embedded media, like textures and video and materials and rough equivalents that exist on, the other sides of those fences. So again, coordinate systems, node hierarchy, scene elements, animations, physics, audio, and embedded media. And the thought that I had here that sort of is prompting where we are today is that this work just seems kind of overwhelming. There's about 100 entries to fill in that table. And when you look at it, you just go, oh my God, how can we ever get to the finish line? But I thought, if you peel off one cell and just do a good job on one cell, it can provide a lot of value. In that vertex attribute document that we worked on, I think is a great demonstration of that. It's in a way microscopic, like as a topic, it's one cell, but gosh, already we answer lots of interesting questions that, are sources of, a support call for me in various forums, like answering these things. And now I have a document that's going to peel off, half of 1% of common questions that I have by just saying, go look here. So I guess I'll just go ahead and find the window again and share it.
I think just one thing worth adding is that what we just saw as a quick overview in the presentation is on a very high level, right? It's about does this feature exist and what it's named. But the reason we need to go deeper, like on the vertex attributes, is that even if the same feature exists in like USD, glTF, and FBX, there may be like very crucial details that either like prevent current interop or just don't exist. So lights is another good example. Like all of these systems have lights, but they vary a lot in how lights are defined, if you can specify things that cast and receive shadows. And so like all these kind of things that are important when you actually want to move a scene from A to B. And so for a lot of these areas, we're probably going to need more of like these detailed documents to actually drill into what are the actionable things that should happen, or what are the differences that people need to be aware of.
Yeah, so with that, let's throw it over to what we want to do with the rest of the meeting. So one idea is we can talk through this first table and just why don't we start there? Why don't we just talk through this table? And I'm going to ask for your help with this, Felix, so that I don't have to invent too many thoughts on the fly. All right. So we have a list of attributes. So position, points, v through f, position, and then the vertex property here. I guess the first question is really, does this table provide the information people are looking for? If I look at this, okay, points, they're v3f, position. I think maybe we need something that tells you way down here how you find these things. Like where are they in a document? I don't know. Is this what people are going to want on landing on this page? And we can assume that they know how to find these things.
I mean, Nick, I mean, maybe a reference even just to like the overall section in the specifications. I don't know if they're near each other, like position, normal, tangent, like in the glTF spec. I don't remember, but if they're close to each other, you might just need one, not one per.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think they're a bit scattered around. Like glTF spec is very long. Of course, everything is in there, but it's very long. And in USD, things are, I would say, a bit even more scattered across like some documentation, some things where Nick and I had to look up in the code for like what is actually in the USD code and what is like handled by convention, just because everyone is doing it that way. So it's a bit mixed. But I think one thing that stood out to me is that, for example, in USD, like there are interesting philosophical differences. Like in USD, a lot of these attributes are implicitly used for something. They're not explicitly defined as, hey, this primvar, this attribute is UV coordinates. So it can have an arbitrary name, and I've seen files like this where it was like you could have primvar pizza, and that's totally fine to name it like that. And that pizza attribute can still be used in a material, and suddenly you have an implicit binding, like that pizza attribute is used as UV coordinate. And so an importing application, if it takes care of like, where's this attribute used, will be able to understand, oh, this is a UV coordinate. I can show this in my UV editor and like use this for texturing because the material knows. But it also means that the very same file, if you didn't have a material in it, suddenly it would lose that implicit binding, and you wouldn't know what to do with that attribute anymore. And that's kind of a, I would say, philosophical difference to glTF, where it's the other way around. Like it's super strictly defined what these attributes are. They have very concrete names. There's no way to dynamically bind custom attributes in a file and so on. And yeah, so there's some of these differences just in how the formats are used. And that leads to interesting challenges, for example, on UV coordinates, which is such a common topic that I think it deserves special, like more time on like talking about interop. Because in USD it can be named any of like 5 or 6 different things that you may see in the wild. And all of these may be used as like UV coordinates. Yeah, and this implicit binding of like we in this document we called it names by convention, like because everyone names it like this, is actually pretty common in USD. Like even things like tangents or vertex colors are just by convention. They don't have like a defined name that you would find in the spec. Yeah, and I think another like difference pointing out is that even if the same thing in this table exists in different worlds, like let's take texture coordinates again, the types may be very different, which is another interesting challenge for actually moving these files around. Like you have, for example, in glTF, texture coordinates can only be two-dimensional. So they're only UV or XY or whatever you want to call it. Whereas in both FBX and USD, they can be two-dimensional, three-dimensional, or four-dimensional. And that is useful for custom shaders, for custom effects, for like UVW mapping and so on. And yeah, that's one of the areas where like I know from day-to-day practice that interoperability there is hard, and actually applications often already today deviate from these specifications to allow data to flow between applications. Like for example, when you export a 3D UV coordinate from Blender, you're happily going to get a glTF file that is not compliant with the glTF specification, but it still contains the data, which is important for everyone who wants to move this into a separate application. And I also brought this up with the respective glTF working groups, and there is interest on getting this right. Like, of course, if applications have started doing things in a not compliant way, then maybe the spec needs to be adjusted to allow it. So yeah, that's the kind of outcomes we should probably aim for here on aligning this a bit more, relaxing some of the constraints so that these can actually be converted.
All right, great thought. Thank you. Okay, so any thoughts from the rest of you? The goal here is to get everyone involved. I'm gonna hold my breath till I turn blue.
Yeah, what do folks think? I mean, look, there's a lot of experience on the call here. I mean, especially around USD and glTF, but I think there's probably also some FBX experience. So it'd be good to hear from folks, even if it's just kind of +1 to what's being talked about here or just other ideas.
Can you hear my voice?
You're very
We can.
quiet, but yes.
Okay, that's because I'm across a room.
Waves across the room.
It's Scott from the Met. I think there was a time, where Felix has examples on his website of, the visual representation of these things, and that that's interesting to tie these to the the actual attributes in the model itself. Like think of a transformer model with all of these attributes that you could call out or see what failed. When you're not a programmer. I know that's a ton of work.
Yeah, I think that's one area I'm always interested in and usually create like little test files for. Basically test files that currently can't be converted, like they have to break when you try to convert them. And that includes like some of the areas here, like around UV coordinates and colors and like blend shapes. Blend shapes usually break everywhere. So and I usually find this interesting to point out these differences because then you're suddenly in areas where you can't even keep the visual representation. I think we talked a lot in these calls about like what does interoperability mean? Like, does it mean getting the same structure of data out, or does it mean keeping the visual consistency of an asset? And yeah, like the vertex attributes area is so important and so like low level in the files that if something is wrong here or can't be converted here, then usually you end up with something that's not visually correct. So it's especially important, yeah.
Yes, that's my only call out is if there was a visualization of what these attributes, how they're used in the formats, aside from just the naming, the semantics. But yeah, like a little diagram. It sounds silly, but then I think people, especially if they're in school learning, because I find that people are slow to try and use these things because they don't understand when something goes wrong. And then you get caught between the different formats and you just skip it. If it doesn't work, you just go back to where you were and start using OBJs again. So that's been my experience. When something breaks, we just start scatter shooting. So maybe if hey, if this is broken, it might be this, and it could build from this document.
Hi, this is Tracy. So I'm a virtual world creator. So I find this really interesting, but the things that I'm kind of reliant on the implementations of like Unreal and Unity. And I know when I import FBX or glTF or GLB files, I know how they perform. So I find this kind of interesting, but it's not like I have a lot of I can't do anything about how they perform, right? Because I have to rely on the environments that I'm using. And especially I think in terms of the tools that are used. So if you're using like Blender, if you're exporting FBX, I know what that's going to look like when it comes into Unity. If you're exporting a GLB, I know there are options, right? You can export it with Y up, Z forward, or you can export it as it is, right? So these are the things that I'm aware of in terms of how I use these environments, but I'm not entirely sure what I can add to this apart from that I'm like the end point in terms of this, right? So I'm not entirely sure what else I can add here in terms of that.
Yeah, maybe
I'm
I
just-
can, oh, sorry.
I'm just adding a bullet point to point out where that might be. Carry on.
I just wanted to say maybe I can provide some pointers on that. So even if it may not always look like this, like the actual implementations of these standards are very much changing between versions. Like Blender ships glTF and USD updates every version. Unity glTF keeps changing and improving. And so what someone who feels to be at kind of the end of this chain can do is report issues like that you find in your workflows or actual bugs where you think this should have worked. And then the interesting thing about like MSF or the Kronos group or OpenUSD is that there's actually people in there that work on this stuff. Like Julian on Kronos group side is doing the Blender glTF implementation and always open for feedback. I'm one of the maintainers of Unity glTF and always improving things there. And so especially if like workflows don't work, like this is a good example, going from Blender to Unity with GLB, there's literally two people like kind of in charge of these implementations that you can tell your woes and that you can tell like where workflows don't work. And then it's on us on figuring out like how can we make that work while staying in the spec.
Yeah, although I have to say, so I have done Blender to Unity, right? I know Unity really well. I know Blender really well. So if you're taking Blender and you're exporting, right? So you've got the option of clicking the box, Y up, right? So you've got the Y up, Z forward option, right? But when you're creating something in Blender, that is Z up, Y forward. And you've got to be careful, because if you do the conversion and you do the default, you end up with it correctly. It's the correct Y up when it comes into Blender, but it's the wrong way round, because it's Y backwards in Blender, it's Y backwards Z up, right? So if you've got to create something in Blender as Y backwards Z up, and then export it to be Y up Z forward in Blender, in Unity, right?
I mean, a lot of things can be said about like coordinate system conversions, but I think it all boils down to, and this has been brought up in these calls a lot as well, like all the formats like FBX, glTF, and USD, they have coordinate systems baked in. So if you export something and you import it somewhere else and it looks wrong, that means either an importer or an exporter does something wrong. Because there are like known coordinate systems in these softwares, and if importers and exporters play nice, then you get the correct result. So for example, this Y up toggle in Blender for glTF, it should not exist. Like this should not be necessary if other applications would properly use the glTF standard. And that problem of coordinate systems was somewhat, like I would say, brought to life by the many options that FBX has in that regard, like where everything is configurable. And so both exporters and importers started adding numerous dropdowns for what you may want to convert on import and export, instead of relying on, okay, this data is actually in the FBX file, we should just respect it. So, but for example, in that case, if you actually have a file that you export from Blender with the default settings and you import in Unity with Unity glTF with the default settings and it's wrong, then please report that as a bug, because that would be a bug.
Yeah. Although I have to say, I don't really care at the end of the day, because I'm doing this in a development environment. So I just rotate it, right? So I don't really care. What I do care about is this at runtime. So, and the only things I'm importing at runtime are my avatars. So my avatars are always GBL. And I have to say that kind of works really well. Okay, so it's kind of from a developer perspective, it depends. At runtime, we don't really care. Sorry, at development time, we don't really care. Development, that's when we really care. The rotation, whether it's Y up or whatever, we will want the right kind of, we want it to come in the right way, right? That's the only time we ever really care. Development, it makes no difference, right? We can move it, right? So.
I can just recommend, please care and report these issues.
Okay.
Yeah, and along those lines, a helpful thing might be to coordinate in this group. We could create a sheet that just lists outstanding issues and requests, and we could round robin, burning down that list and saying, have we heard back from the folks at Blender? Stuff like that might be good, as opposed to just back channels and out of view and uncoordinated, asking the same question in many places.
I agree. I think that, to me, Blender is like the outlier, and we're always converting, and everything's always wrong going in and out, and it's just a nuisance. But we want to make a collection of assets that are uniform to share across all platforms. And those little things just burn time, and it makes you feel uncertain. And it'd be great to have those conversations with Blender, like, if the industry's like newer tools are going in a direction and the newer formats are working, it'd be great if you could just set that in your main preferences and just lock it down there instead of clicking it in a plugin. And it's just very frail, in my opinion. And some tools are very friendly and they're consistent.
Neil had his hand up first, and then Thomas.
Yeah, I just want to kind of add encouragement to Tracy that, as Felix was saying, I think you're using these tools now, and I'm sure they seem a little unmovable and monolithic at times, but no, it doesn't have to be. I think if we do gather these issues that are just, as people were saying, it's burning time and adding friction. My dream is that we get the tool centers here because they actually find this forum useful. And if we're bringing these issues and positively trying to help fix them, I think that's a good for everybody. And there's also a longer term kind of aim here. I think is that you mentioned, Tracy, that sometimes you're exporting GLBs, sometimes you're exporting FBXs. There's been I think Nick kind of alluded to this at the beginning. FBX is quite long in the tooth. There's quite a lot of interest in making sure that glTF and USD can handle what FBX is being used for. So I would really love to know, which are the cases where you have, you choose to export FBX. Is it just because it works better? That's maybe a thing, but that's something we should fix. But even more interesting, is there functionality in FBX that still isn't in USD or glTF in a usable toolchain friendly way? Because that is input that is directly interesting to the standards bodies. Yeah,
I can actually answer that. Well, at least from my perspective.
Yeah.
So from a tool perspective, between Unity and Unreal, FBX is generally, if you are looking for any like training courses or anything, people tend to use FBX. And so FBX and in terms of the tooling in Unity, they're talking about importing FBXs or exporting FBXs, right? This is just historical, right? And so I think it's an historical thing. So when I'm creating I don't know, a wall with a door, right? I will create it in Blender and export it as an FBX. Use it in my Unity environment. I will do I always everything is light baked, right? Everything looks great as an FBX and so on, and therefore I use it. So it's like an historical thing. It works, it's fine, and so on and so forth. But saying that, all of my avatars are GBL. If I'm doing, I don't know, an image using AI to image 3D object and export it and import it into Unity, it's a GLB. They all work absolutely fine. So there's no kind of, does it work well or not with using GLB or FBX? It's just that it's kind of if you're creating your own thing, it's I suppose it's just traditional that you would do it and export as FBX, and that seems to be the main thing rather than it being work better. There's nothing specific about it that is better than a GLB. I would say it's just tradition. I would say.
Well, that's useful data right there. It's education and inertia. Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Thomas?
Yeah, I've got two points. One is sometimes import plugins from other formats try to misuse Blender-specific functionality, like inverting one of the scale axes that may result in exporting to USD, an example, with inverted normals that can end up horrible when using AR single-sided. That's one point. And I would like to point out, are we talking mostly about how can we dissolve FBX use and replace it by GLB or glTF and USD? Or do we really need round processing functionality? Then we
did you
need to
say inverse normals there?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I use inverse normals because I sometimes want to use inverse normals. Is you saying that?
But you use it intentionally. But if
okay,
if the Blender exporter has all axes inverted, scale -1, -1, -1, then it bails out. It doesn't figure out how to place normals. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I understand.
As an example.
Because normals, because sometimes you need to go back into Blender and fix your normals, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I have done that before, but I've intentionally done inverse normals because I want to create something where I have the material inside, right? So I've got like
Sure.
like a sphere, and I want something within the sphere rather than outside of the sphere.
But
yeah.
Felix pointed out, when the standard importer uses default settings, then export default should work as intended. And when this doesn't happen, for such edge cases in the data, then
what are you doing then? Because I've never found it. I've never found an export from Blender screwing up the normals. Are you exporting as FBX or what are you doing? Sorry here.
That's not the topic right now.
I think we're like the issue there is one that is really hard in my experience to explain to people in general, which is there's a difference between like getting the interchange between the softwares right in terms of the data, and then how different softwares interpret different types of data. And for example, like non-uniform scales in general and like inverted scales in some axes is one of those topics where this is not really the fault of the file formats. There's just different interpretations on what different softwares do in that case. So they may decide to flip the mesh normals. They may not decide to flip the mesh normals. They may invert the lighting. They may not invert the lighting. And this, there it's more of a difference in what the viewers do, the different viewing implementations. You're not in the land anymore where the file formats can do anything wrong or right. You're in the areas where just the interpretation of the data between different viewers differs. And if you want to do a fun experiment, try across all the softwares you use what happens when you scale a light non-uniformly, or when you invert a camera transform on one axis, and you're going to get super interesting results that are different in every application because they interpret the data differently. And it's an entirely separate topic, unfortunately, from file formats, where like on file formats, I think in this group, we have some amount of control and some amount of potential for change. I don't see us changing every viewer implementation and saying this is the right way to interpret as an object that is like negatively scaled in one axis. So that's an entirely separate topic. It is an interoperability topic, but it's outside of the scope, I think, on what the file formats can even do.
Yeah.
So folks, there's about 5 minutes left for the regular meeting. So I want to ask Nick, Felix, I mean, one is this seems like a super productive use of time, and there's been a lot of good input here. In terms of trying to converge for potential next steps here, do you have more questions for the groups or ideas on where we should go next?
Okay, one, I want to respond to Thomas's question. As it says on my title bar here with my big empty document, it's a migration from FBX, and the reason we're migrating, and to address the tradition comment, is that the FBX code base is not a code base that is maintained a lot. Like, we're not getting new features in FBX, and there's a migration in vendors that support FBX to also support other file formats in preference. And I think that's a strategic direction overall that we're trying to help facilitate as we move away from a code base that doesn't integrate well in modern software projects generally, like to kind of negatively characterize the current state of FBX on behalf of the people who are responsible for maintaining it. So next steps are continue working on this doc. There were lots of great comments that I tried to gather and pull out as we spoke. There's still to-dos here in progress. And so I'd like to ask people who are interested to come to this document and add thoughts, even if it's just questions or challenges. That's helpful. If it's proposed wording, then that's even better. Just grab a section that you want to work on, use the comment mechanism. Then we can discuss on the side and just hit approve to merge requests. And then there's the other bit that I showed, which is, I think this is, like, just based on Mark's initial analysis, a reasonable set of bullet points to help us flesh out an overall roadmap. So perhaps we can incept a roadmap document. I can populate it with these initial thoughts, and then in another working session, perhaps we can work through those individual points and decide, like, yeah, these are things we should work on, what's missing, anything we want to take out. So I guess that's the answer.
Just looking at your screen right now, if I recall correctly, USD supports several materials, one for preview surface and one for final render. And
Oh yeah, where's the material page?
Okay.
Great point. Okay. Note taken.
It makes everything more complex, but it's a reality.
It sure is.
Yeah, and I think generally the topic there would be fallbacks for data, because you have, like, for example, in glTF, you can have that for textures, and like you can have textures in different form.
You're cut off.
Sorry?
You were cut off.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to say that there's similar to how there's a fallback mechanism in USD for materials, there's fallback mechanisms in glTF for mesh extensions and for texture extensions and so on, where you may have a compressed mesh, but you're still providing the uncompressed mesh for everyone who doesn't know what to do with the compressed mesh. And so you also end up with like two meshes, but the viewer will choose just one. And it's very similar with the materials in USD, where you can have, similar to the attribute names, you can have prefixes, and then there can be a super specific material graph that will only work in Arnold renderer and nowhere else. Or you can have a generic USD preview surface that hopefully works everywhere, and so on.
Or you have USD assets from NVIDIA only using MDL. Yeah.
Okay, that's another one missing from the original work, and FBX definitely has a story about LODs that we didn't capture in the initial analysis. I think we got animation clips, because that's another thorn in my side right now.
Yeah, where animation interoperability really gets interesting is if you have multiple animations in a file, or if you have targeted animations that only are like for specific objects in a file, or if you start animating non-transforms, like you start animating materials, where you also get into interesting differences in practice.
So I really love this. We're already working grouping up what I hope we can do next time. And I will call attention to the clock again, because otherwise, I personally want to keep going for another hour or something, and that's going to just eat into my prep time for my next meeting. And same for you guys too, I'm sure.
But Nick, on that note, I mean, I think this call has been quite magical, frankly, and I love momentum as well. So I do want to ask you and Felix, and I will be putting you on the spot, but how soon would you want to do another working session like this? Like, should we try to interleave it, with one of the upcoming education sessions? Should we put it for the whole block, the very next one that that we can? Like, what would you like?
I think this problem is evergreen, and I think we're going to be able to boil the enthusiasm pot if we meet in a week or a month. I don't think we're going to go stale. So I know there's education sessions coming, so we should keep the momentum of that. There's been lots of great talk on splats. Hooray! This is currently, in my opinion, the best venue for splat discussions. So interleave. Does that sound good?
Gotcha. Okay. So yeah, maybe we'll take it offline to see if this would fit in May. But yeah, hear you on the interleave, because we do have materials in 2 weeks.
We could also do a time boxing thing. So we could time box with a hard, just grab 10 minutes in every meeting just to say, here's what happened. Here's what we did. We need input. Give it now. We could do that.
Okay. All right. Just taking some notes on the options here. We'll figure it out maybe offline. But yeah, anything we can do to keep the conversation going is important. And then one last again idea I got while you guys were talking, and actually while you were showing the slide deck in particular, is of course we'll have a birds of a feather session at SIGGRAPH around 30 asset interop. And this slide deck, actually what I'm seeing is maybe the start of an awesome way to kick that off. So I don't know what your guys' SIGGRAPH plans are, and you don't need to commit today, but maybe it's something to keep on the radar.
This would make a good BOF or 10-minute whirlwind intro to a project sort of thing.
Cool. Well, look, I'll make a note and maybe hit you guys up officially soon. Felix, Nick, just any other input or actions you were looking for from this part of the meeting?
Oh, I think y'all know I want everybody in the pool playing with the toys. Felix, any comments?
Not right now.
Yeah, I would say there's the opposite of turf here. You want everyone engaged and everyone involved, and yeah, I think the welcomingness here has been evident. Cool. Well, look, Felix, Nick, let's do a round of applause